organizations hire attorneys and judges.
Yeah. Yeah. And a graduate professor that I did. But I almost did an internship there the year before. I ended up in the State Department. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. What did you get for your graduate degree?
I was international affairs. I was at the Elliott School at UW. I did undergrad there too.
Oh. Did you go straight into a master's program?
Yeah. That was about 7 years ago.
So you've been in DC for a very long time?
Yeah. I'm from Boston.
Okay. I'm from California as well.
San Francisco? Oh, okay. I've heard SF.
Yeah, with the North housing.
Yeah. Yeah, my brother is actually a Populist.
Oh, great.
That helps farmers. Yeah. Yeah, he's working on helping farmers be more productive. So they'll take raw data from farmers, like what are they planting, what are their yields, and that kind of stuff. Yeah. You don't think of farmers like technology, but actually they're quite interesting. They have something like 2,000 farmers in their network, and the more people they bring in, the better their data. So I think a lot of it is small farms. Part of it is trying to break the large agribusinesses. Fertilizer is no better than another fertilizer on huge farms. So the models will show there is no difference. So it's very much empowered people kind of collaboration.
What are they called?
It's called Farmers Business Network. Got all of them.
Is he a coder?
He is a data analyst statistician. But they do have people who use code and stuff, but he's building things, basically.
So you're nice.
Sure, liberal arts. Grand prose books. Yeah, I just got a lot of productions. Stuff. Need that. I was able to work on the stuff.
So what do you do?
I'm the Taiwan desk director. So I basically work on all aspects of it. Smart sales, training, do dialogues with them. So we coordinate all aspects of the relationship.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Embassy of Canada. Bienvenue à l'ambassade du Canada. My name is Martin Loken, and I'm Minister of Political Affairs here at the Embassy, and it's my great honor to welcome you on behalf of Ambassador David McNaughton. And it's wonderful to see such a terrific turnout of guests from our partner organization, the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as so many of you from academia, from think tanks, from government, and elsewhere. Welcome to the Embassy. I'd also like to thank, in particular, Sydney Lipset, with you. And we're going to be joined shortly by a few members. We expect to be joined shortly by a few members of Parliament from Canada, from the Finance Committee, who are in town visiting. And of course, we look forward to hearing from our speaker this evening, William Galston. He's going to be formally introduced in a few moments. After I introduce the person who will introduce the person who will introduce me. So I will be very brief. You might ask, why Canada? Why is it that this event is hosted here? Well, we're very proud to be here hosting this event. And one of the reason really is that Professor Lipset devoted so much of his career to research in Canada as a way to insight into democratic developments in the United States and across the world. Canada and the United States certainly have a great deal in common. We're the closest of friends, partners, and allies, and also we have a long history of support for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law around the world. This year's lecture, The Populist Challenge to Liberal Democracy, is particularly apropos to this moment, and not just for academic purposes. Take trade, take NAFTA, for example. As Canada, your biggest customer, don't forget that, continues to work with the US and Mexico to renegotiate the agreement, we understand that too many have felt left behind, and we must modernize the agreement to make it more fair for middle-class workers across North America. That's why the Government of Canada has prioritized a progressive trade agenda and is seeking to include new chapters on trade and gender and Indigenous peoples, as well as stronger provisions on workers' rights and environmental protections. As our Foreign Minister has said, Canadians broadly support free trade, but their enthusiasm wavers when trade agreements put our workers at an unfair disadvantage because of the high standards that we rightly demand. Instead, we must pursue progressive trade agreements that are win-win, helping workers both at home and abroad to enjoy higher wages and better conditions. But enough about trade. Look, we're really here to listen to tonight's lecture, and Canada is very proud to have this close partnership with the National Endowment for Democracy, an organization that's done much to grow and strengthen democratic institutions around the world. This annual event helps us all deepen our thinking on democratic trends and how we can improve the quality of our democracies. The president of the NED, Carl Gershman, of course, who many of you know very well, is a good friend of Canada, and we're delighted that he's here. Throughout his career, he's served the cause of democracy as an academic, as a diplomat, and now with the NED. And before I invite him to take the podium, let me just say I look forward to seeing all of you after the lecture tonight outside in the lobby area for a reception, and do also check out the gallery next door, or within the embassy, and the photographs from Brian Adams. So with that, again, welcome to the embassy, and I'd like to invite Carl Gershman to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I'm really not here to introduce the person who will introduce the speaker, but to give a lot of people thanks. And I want to begin by thanking Minister Loken for his generous remarks. And also I want to thank the Embassy of Canada for once again hosting the Lipset lecture. Now, in its 14th year, this annual event is an opportunity to take stock of some key dimensions of the state of democracy in the world today, and it's also an opportunity to celebrate both the work of Marty Lipset and the friendship between the United States and Canada, which was so important to Marty. There are always many people who labor very hard to put on such an event like this, and I want to single out this evening from the Canadian Embassy, Victoria Benner, Adrian Rooney, and Jerica Cooley, and from the NED, Melissa Ayton, Brent Culmer, and Andrea Blazanovich. They have our thanks. I also want to thank the sponsors of tonight's lecture, Johns Hopkins University Press, that publishes our Journal of Democracy, and that is represented here tonight by Bill Breitner, and also the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, that is represented here tonight by Professor Judith Wildy. And of course, I also want to thank Sid Lipset, Marty's widow, who has once again reproduced in pamphlet form an essay by Marty that is related to the theme of the lecture. The new pamphlet, which is available outside, is Democracy and Working Class Authoritarianism, a version of which appears as the 4th chapter in Marty's seminal book, Political Man. Sid's devotion to making sure that every aspect of the Lipset lecture is done properly and with a certain elegance makes the occasion a very special experience for all of our friends who are here and who work on it. I'll leave it to Mark Plattner to introduce Bill Goulston. I just want to thank Bill for being such a smart and stalwart champion of democracy. He served for 9 years on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and he never missed an opportunity to make sure that we were being intellectually disciplined, on our toes, and alert to the latest underlying political trends and developments. He remains involved with NED, having traveled last month to the Republic of Georgia to give the keynote address to a regional gathering of democracy activists grappling with the challenge of how to stay connected to grassroots and often traditional sectors of the population. And just yesterday, he spoke at NED on the subject of religion and democracy to a visiting delegation of Orthodox priests and other religious leaders from Georgia. I've had the pleasure of reading the draft of Bill's forthcoming book, Analyzing the Crisis of Liberal Democracy, and I can say without any hesitation that it's a model of fresh thinking about how to reform and reinvent our divided country. Bill has emerged as a unique voice for liberal values at a troubled time for democracy, and I await his lecture this evening with great expectation. It's now my pleasure to invite Mark Plattner to introduce this year's Lipset lecturer, William Goulston.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome to you all. It's really a very great pleasure for me to introduce William A. Galston, this year's presenter of the Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World. It's hard for me to believe, and I'm sure it's hard for Bill to believe as well, that the two of us have now known each other for more than half a century, having met when he was a college senior and I was a first-year graduate student at Cornell. Though we never became really close friends, we've regularly been in touch over the subsequent years, and I have marveled at the progress of his extraordinary career. There are many people, especially in Washington, who straddle or traverse back and forth the lines separating political life and academic life. But typically their academic work is highly political, and their political work is recognizably academic. But Bill has bridged this divide in a rather different way. His political work has involved the rough and tumble of electoral and White House politics, while his academic work has in large part focused on studies in political theory aimed at a primarily scholarly audience. To be sure, he's also strayed from both sides into the middle ground of public policy. Bill has worked on 6 presidential campaigns, starting with the independent candidacy of Congressman John B. Anderson way back in 1980, and later with a full roster of nominees and contenders for the nomination from the Democratic Party. From 1993 to 1995, Bill served as President Clinton's Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy. And his deep knowledge of both of policy issues and of electoral strategies has made him a valued advisor to candidates and government officials alike. At the same time, he's pursued a distinguished academic career, teaching at the University of Texas first, then at the University of Maryland, where he was acting dean and Saul Stern professor at the School of Public Policy and director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy. He remains a College Park professor at the University of Maryland, but since 2006, his primary affiliation has been as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he holds the Ezra K. Zilkha Chair in Government Studies. In 2006, he was given the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Award in recognition of his efforts, and I quote, to revive and exemplify the classical understanding of political science as a practical discipline, one that arises directly out of the characteristic conflicts of political life, takes its bearings from those conflicts, and seeks to provide impartial guidance to statesmen and to citizens. At the outset of his career as an academic political theorist, Bill didn't shy away from weighty scholarly subjects. His first book, published in 1975, was entitled Kant and the Problem of History. His second, a few years later, was entitled Justice and the Human Good. During the next 2 decades, he also somehow found time to produce 2 books on U.S. rural development policy. But increasingly, his scholarly writing focused on an effort to understand and to defend liberalism. Liberalism understood not as a label for a particular camp in American partisan politics, but liberal in the sense conveyed by the adjective in the phrase liberal democracy. And this led to the publication of 3 major books: Liberal Purposes in 1991, Liberal Pluralism in 2002, and The Practice of Liberal Pluralism in 2004. In more recent years, Bill's writing has largely taken the form of essays and book chapters. His CV indicates that he's written more than I'd realized on questions related to religion, and especially to Judaism. But he's also continued to address a staggeringly broad range of topics in political theory, American politics, and public policy. But despite this variety, the perennial questions of what is right and what is to be done, as these are expressed and fought over in the political arena, remain at the very center of his attention. Those of you who read his excellent weekly op-ed column in the Wall Street Journal will be aware that of late he's also started to pay more attention to international affairs. This may be partly due to the 9 years he recently spent as a very active board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, as Carl already remarked upon. But I suspect it's also a reflection of his growing concern with the international phenomenon of populism and the threat that it poses to the liberal pluralism that he holds dear. Earlier this year, Bill contributed a powerful essay on the populist moment to the April 2017 issue of the Journal of Democracy. Though this was part of a group of articles on the 2016 U.S. elections, Bill emphasized that America was by no means exceptional in its recent political evolution or in its vulnerability to populism. The danger that populism presents both to pluralism and to liberalism continues to preoccupy him. It's the subject of his newest book, which will be published by Yale University Press in March. And it's a topic that he will speak to us about tonight in a lecture entitled The Populist Challenge to Liberal Democracy. It's my very great pleasure to call to the podium Bill Goulston. Bill?
Well, Mark, thank you so much for that extraordinary introduction. I'm sorry my parents are not here this evening. My father would have enjoyed that introduction, and my mother would have believed it. I have a confession to make, and that is that being invited to deliver a lecture in memory of Seymour Martin Lipset, a great student of politics and society, is one of the signal honors of my life, and I will regard it as such to my dying day. There are a lot of people to thank. I'll miss a lot of them. But I do want to begin by thanking Minister Logan for his warm greeting and for his embassy's unflagging hospitality over the years. I want to thank Carl, Gershman, Mark, and everybody who was involved in the selection process that led up to this lecture. I especially want to thank our old friend Sidney Lipset, who's done so much to keep Marty's torch raised high and burning bright in the years since his death. As I drafted this lecture, Marty's masterpiece, Political Man, was at my side. Many of its chapters are as fresh as they were 6 decades ago. Some would create a storm of controversy if they were updated and republished today, including the 1950s version of the essay that is available for distribution right outside this door. All of them, I think it's safe to say, bring much needed light into the confusion and darkness of the present. All of us should be grateful then that Marty resisted intense parental pressure to become a dentist. Although it must be admitted that it would have been much steadier work than the Young People's Socialist League that he selected instead of dental school. But on to the business at hand. For those who believe in liberal democracy, it's sobering to review the events of the past quarter century. Back then, liberal democracy was on the march. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union had collapsed. New democracies were emerging throughout Europe and beyond. Russia seemed in transition to democracy. South Africa's apartheid regime was tottering. And even though China's government had brutally repressed a democracy movement, it was possible to believe, as many scholars did, and as Marty might have done, that a more educated and prosperous Chinese middle class would eventually and irresistibly demand democratic reforms. Liberal democracy had triumphed, it seemed, not only in practice but also in principle. It was the only legitimate form of government. There was no alternative. That was then. Today, as you all know, the world scene is very different. Liberal democracy faces multiple external challenges, from ethno-national autocracies, from regimes based on God's word rather than the will of the people, from the success of strong-handed meritocracy in places such as Singapore, and, not least, from the astonishing accomplishments of what some have called China's Market-Leninist system. But there's a different kind of challenge to liberal democracy, an internal challenge, from populists who seek to drive a wedge between democracy and liberalism. Liberal norms and policies, they claim, weaken democracy and, in so doing, harm the people. Thus, they conclude, liberal institutions that prevent the people from acting democratically in their own interest should be set aside. It is on this latter challenge, the internal challenge, that I'd like to focus this evening. So first, what's happening? From Middle Europa to the English Midlands to America's Midwest, a revolt has developed against long-standing political arrangements. Many of you, no doubt, can recite the key milestones of this revolt. The Brexit vote, the 2016 US election, the doubling of support for France's Front National, the rise of the five-star movement in Italy, the entrance of the AfD into Germany's Bundestag, the elections in Austria and the Netherlands, where the traditional parties of the right prevailed only by moving towards the policies of the far right, the outright victory of the ANO in the Czech Republic, and most troubling, the entrenchment of Hungarian leader Viktor Orban's self-styled illiberal democracy, which seems to be metastasizing into a template of Poland's Law and Justice Party and, some scholars believe, insurgent parties in Western Europe as well. This revolt threatens the assumptions that shaped the march of liberal democracy just a couple of decades ago, and that still guide mainstream politicians and policymakers from the center-left to the center-right. When I began writing about this emerging revolt some years ago, I believed that economics lay at its core. Contemporary liberal democracies, I argued, rested on a tacit compact between peoples on the one hand and elected representatives and unelected experts on the other. The people would defer to elites as long as they delivered sustained prosperity and steadily improving living standards. If elites stopped managing the economy effectively, all bets were off. This compact, my argument continued, began to weaken with growing competition from developing nations, which put pressure on policies designed to protect citizens against labor market risks. In many Western democracies, the erosion of the manufacturing sector destabilized regions and political arrangements. The urbanization of opportunity, the shift of economic dynamism away from smaller communities and rural areas towards a handful of metropolitan areas intensified these effects. Inequality rose. A global economy, it turned out, served the interests of most people in developing countries and of elites in advanced countries, but not the interests of working and middle classes in the developed economies, which had been the principal beneficiaries of the golden decades after World War II. Against this backdrop, the Great Recession that began in late 2007 represented a colossal failure of economic stewardship, and leaders' inability to restore vigorous economic growth compounded the felony. As economies struggled and unemployment persisted, the groups and regions that failed to rebound lost confidence in mainstream parties and established institutions, fueling the populist upsurge that has upended American politics, threatens the European Union, and challenges liberal governance itself in several of the newer communities. This was the heart of the matter, or so I thought. In recent years, however, I've come to believe, as have other scholars, that it represents only a portion of a larger and more complex truth, a structural explanation that places economics at the base and treats other issues as derivative, distorts a more complicated reality. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union all failed to deal with waves of immigration in ways that commanded public support. Not only did immigrants compete with longtime inhabitants for jobs and social services, they were also seen as threatening long-established cultural norms and public safety as well. Post-election analyses show that concerns about immigration largely drove the Brexit referendum, the 2016 US presidential election, and the gains of far-right parties across Europe. The technological change that has triggered new modes of production and a shift towards more knowledge-intensive economies has also catalyzed the rise of an education-based meritocracy that now dominates government, the bureaucracy, the media, and major metropolitan areas. The emergence of this new elite has left less educated citizens in outlying towns and rural areas feeling denigrated and devalued, which has sown deep resentment. As the British analyst David Goodhart vividly puts it, these economic and social developments have divided democratic citizenries into anywheres, individuals whose identities are professional and who could use their skills in many places at home and abroad, and on the other hand, somewheres, individuals whose identities are tightly bound to particular places. A college degree, it turns out, not only expands economic opportunities, but reshapes individuals' entire outlook. These trends are deepening social divisions between long-established groups and newer entrants into the civic community, between those who benefit from technological change and those who are threatened by it, but between the cities and the countryside, between more and less educated citizens, between those who celebrate dynamism and diversity and those who prize stability and homogeneity. Elite's preference for open society is running up against public demands for economic, cultural, and political closure. All too often, liberal democracy is conflated with the spread of a cultural liberalism at odds with custom and religion, to the great disapproval of those who practice these customs and are religious believers. Battered by economic dislocation, demographic change, and challenges to traditional values, many less educated citizens came to feel that their lives were outside their control. The national and international governing institutions they thought would step in when individual agency proved insufficient seemed frozen or indifferent. Many citizens lost confidence in the future and longed instead for a past, in part imagined, that insurgent politicians promised to restore. In the United States, partisan polarization gridlocked the system, preventing progress on problems that demanded concerted action. In Europe, the opposite phenomenon, a center-left, center-right duopoly that kept important issues off the public agenda, had much the same effect. Throughout the West, there's rising impatience with governments that seem incapable of acting forcefully to deal with mounting problems. Some parties and movements are questioning the norms and institutions of liberal democracy itself, especially freedom of the press, the rule of law, and the rights of minorities. Rising insecurity has triggered a demand for strong leaders, risking a return to forms of authoritarianism that many thought had been left behind for good, at least in the West. To understand what these developments may mean for liberal democracy, I begin from my academic home base political theory with a theoretical framework. And to this end, I want to distinguish and then connect four concepts: the Republican principle, democracy, constitutionalism, and finally liberalism. By the Republican principle, I mean popular sovereignty. Put more formally, the people as the sole source of legitimacy. Otherwise put, only the people can rightly authorize forms of government. This idea is at the heart of the most American of all documents, the Declaration of Independence, which famously asserts that governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And consistent with the Declaration, James Madison in the Federalist Papers says, quote, "We may define a republic to be a government that derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from the people." Now, briefly, democracy. At the most basic level, democracy requires the equality of all citizens along with broadly inclusive citizenship. A society in which all citizens were equal, but only 10% of adults were citizens, would not today count as a democracy. Majoritarian rule is the other key pillar of democratic governance. This means, first, that public decisions are made by popular majorities of citizens whose votes all count equally, and second, that democratic decision-making extends to a maximally wide range of public matters. Majoritarianism is limited only by the liberties and powers, such as freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, that citizens need to influence public decisions. In this conception of democracy, unmodified by any adjective, there is nothing essentially undemocratic about majoritarian decisions that systematically disadvantage specific individuals and groups, as long as their democratic equality, inclusion, and powers are not touched. Nor are majoritarian decisions undemocratic if they invade privacy rights. If it wishes, a democratic public may embrace the maxim that it is better for 10 guilty individuals to go free than for one innocent individual to be found guilty, but it is no less democratic if it adopts the opposite view. Nor is it undemocratic per se to conduct judicial proceedings in the same manner as legislative affairs. The assembly that condemned Socrates may have been wrong, but it was fully democratic. Third concept, constitutionalism, which denotes basic enduring structures of formal institutional power, typically but not always codified in writing. This codified structure is basic in that it provides the basis for the conduct of public life, and it is enduring because it typically involves entrenchment, some mechanism that makes it harder to change the structure itself than to amend or to reverse decisions made within that structure. Constitutions are double-edged. They both organize power and establish boundaries for the institutions that wield it. These limits can be horizontal, thus the familiar separation of powers and checks and balances. They can also be vertical. Through federalism, public power is divided and dispersed among different levels of jurisdiction. Now note that these limits need not constrain public power in the aggregate. Constitutionalism is compatible with an understanding of public power as total, at least in its scope. So, for example, if the national government has limited police powers, but subordinate jurisdictions are free to regulate what the national government may not, which is not a completely inaccurate description of the situation that prevailed in our founding constitutional period, then in principle there's nothing beyond government's reach. That is why the decision to limit public power in all its aspects marks the line between constitutionalism per se and the specific type of constitutionalism we call liberal. We have reached now the core idea of liberalism. Recognizing and protecting a sphere beyond the rightful reach of government at any level or lodged in any institution, a sphere in which individuals can enjoy independence and privacy. In this spirit, the Declaration of Independence both invokes and limits the Republican principle. Because all human beings are endowed with rights that governments do not create and individuals may not surrender, the Republican principle can authorize only forms of government that honor these rights. Governments are created to secure them, not to redefine or abridge them. We can now venture a more precise characterization of liberal democracy. This type of political order rests on the Republican principle, takes constitutional form, and endorses the civic, egalitarian, and majoritarian principles of democracy. At the same time, it accepts and enforces the liberal principle that the legitimate scope of public power is limited. And this, in turn, involves some abridgment of majoritarianism as the modus operandi of decision-making. A liberal order can use devices such as supermajorities or even unanimity rules to enforce these liberal limits, and it can deploy constitutional courts insulated from direct public pressure to police the perimeter beyond which even supermajorities may not go. On this basis, I now turn to the populist challenge to liberal democracy. Populism, I want to argue, is not merely an emotion-laden expression of disappointment at frustrated economic expectations, resentment against rigged rules and special interests, and fear of threats to physical and cultural security, as some observers have suggested. Populism has a coherent structure, even if it lacks the kind of elaborated theories or canonical texts that defined the great isms of the 20th century. Measured against the fourfold conceptual template that I've sketched, populism accepts the principles of popular sovereignty and democracy, understood straightforwardly as the exercise of majoritarian power. It is skeptical about constitutionalism to the extent that formal, bounded institutions and procedures impede majorities from working their will. And it takes a very dim view of liberal protections for individuals and minority groups. It might seem, then, that contemporary populism is what many scholars and at least one national leader call illiberal democracy, a governing system capable of translating popular preferences into public policy without the impediments that have prevented liberal democracies from responding effectively to urgent problems. From this perspective, populism is a threat not to democracy per se, but rather to the dominant liberal variant of democracy, which new challenges have rendered obsolete. Indeed, some observers contend that populism so understood is not without merit because it represents, as the phrase goes, an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. When elites take important issues such as economic, monetary, and regulatory policy off the public agenda and assign them to institutions insulated from public scrutiny and interference, They invite precisely the popular revolt that now threatens to overwhelm them. From this perspective, which is widespread, populism is less than an attack on democracy than a response and corrective to a perceived deficit of democracy. But to stop here would be to leave half the story untold, the more important half, in my view. Because populism embraces the Republican principle of popular sovereignty, it faces the question inherent in this principle. Who are the people? When we say we, what do we mean? The opening sentences of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the opening sentence, I should say, assumes the existence of a distinct people with the right to dissolve its connection with another distinct people. But who or what is this people being invoked as this collective agent of self-liberation? This may sound like an abstract theoretical question. It is anything but that. We now understand we the people as all of us, all citizens, regardless of religion, manners, customs, and length of citizenship. The people, then, is an ensemble of individuals who enjoy a common civic status, essentially a legal status. During America's founding period, however, a thicker understanding prevailed, or at least ran alongside that legal understanding. John Jay wrote in Federalist No. 2, and I quote, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs." From our vantage point, we may wonder where this left African Americans, not to mention Catholics, and those for whom German was the language of daily life, a very significant minority in the founding period. Making a long story very short, you can read American history as a constant tension between the legal civic definition of citizenship on the one hand and a definition that reflects characteristics of individuals and groups on the other, different from their civic status. Now, bringing this conversation back to populism. Historically, right-leaning populists have emphasized shared ethnicity and common descent as the basis of peoplehood, while left-leaning populists have often defined the people in class terms, excluding those with wealth and power. Recently, a third definition has entered public debate: the people versus the cultural elites. Real people eat hamburgers, listen to country and western music, drink wine, and watch Duck Dynasty. Globalist snobs do whatever PBS, NPR, and the New York Times deem refined. Now, despite these differences of the axis of division, ethnicity, class, culture, when populists distinguish between the people and the elite, however they do it, each one of these groups is understood as homogeneous. So in this construction, the people have one set of interests and values, the elite another, and they are not only different but fundamentally opposed. The divisions are moral as well as empirical, according to the populists. The people are uniformly virtuous, the elite is hopelessly corrupt. Populist leaders claim that they alone represent the people, the only legitimate force in society. If the people are homogeneous and virtuous, there is no reason that they should not govern themselves and their societies without institutional restraints. This approach raises some obvious difficulties. First, it is divisive by definition. Within the context of popular sovereignty, one of our four guiding principles, dividing a country's population into the people and the others suggests that some parts of the population are not really part of the people. and do not deserve to share fully in self-government. Individuals outside the charmed circle of the people, however it is understood, may therefore be excluded from equal citizenship, violating the principle of inclusion that is essential to democracy as we now understand it. Here's the second difficulty. The populist definition of the people is inherently counterfactual. According to a leading scholar, populists speak and act as if the people could develop a singular judgment, a singular will, and hence a singular, unambiguous mandate. But of course, they cannot. They never have. They never will. In circumstances of even partial liberty, different social groups will have different interests, values, origins, and faiths, as James Madison famously pointed out in Federalist 10. Plurality, not homogeneity, characterizes most peoples most of the time. But populism is the enemy of pluralism, and thus of modern democracy. Imposing the assumption of uniformity on the reality of diversity not only distorts the facts, but elevates the characteristics of some social groups over others. To the extent that this occurs, populism becomes a threat to democracy. Because, as Jan Werner Muller, a leading expert on populism, puts it, democracy requires pluralism and the recognition that we need to find fair terms of living together as free, equal, but also irreducibly diverse citizens. A line that deserves to be bronzed, in my opinion. Whatever may have been possible in classical republics, no form of identity politics can serve as the basis for a modern democracy, which stands and falls with the protection of pluralism in all its forms. Equally counterfactual is the proposition that the people are uniformly virtuous. They are not, of course. Political movements based on this premise of public virtue inevitably come to grief, but not before disappointment gives way to a violent search for hidden enemies. Drop a footnote here to the terror of the French Revolution and the multiple terrors of the Stalin period. If the factory production wasn't up to snuff, it can't be the government's fault, the manager's fault, or the worker's fault. It's the record's fault. The evil Trotskyists, of whom, one of whom was, the gentleman we honored tonight. The presumption of the people's monopoly on virtue undermines democratic practice. Decision-making in circumstances of diversity typically requires compromise, but compromise is hard to accept if one group or party believes that the other embodies pure evil. In these circumstances, how on earth can compromise be good? Better no action at all than dishonorable concessions to the forces of darkness. Populist leaders attack the enemies of the people in moralistic terms, as self-seeking, corrupt, and given to conspiracies against ordinary citizens, which often involve links with power holders in other countries. Populism requires constant combat with these enemies and endless struggle against the forces they represent. In short, populism plunges democratic societies into an endless series of moralized zero-sum conflicts. It threatens the rights of minorities. It blocks compromise, and it enables strong leaders to dismantle the checkpoints on the road to autocracy. How serious is this threat? Here, I take a position that I think separates me from many others who have plunged into this topic. On the one hand, it's no time for complacency, that is for sure. Liberal democracy faces clear and present dangers. On the other hand, I want to underscore a less fashionable point. This is no time for panic either. The best stance is reality-based concern, as detached from fear and foreboding as we can manage. History offers a valuable corrective to myopia. As you know, we're just a decade past the severest financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. A recent study of politics in the wake of financial crises over the past 140 years finds a consistent pattern. After each one of these financial crises, majority parties shrink, far-right parties gain, polarization intensifies, fragmentation increases, uncertainty rises, and governing becomes more difficult. Economic historians tell us, moreover, that unlike cyclical recessions, the effect of financial crises typically take a decade and sometimes more to unwind. It was not until this year that middle-class families in the United States regained the level of income they enjoyed prior to the Great Recession in late 2007. They have not yet regained the wealth that they lost during this period. The lag for middle-class and working-class families in Europe is even worse. We may also gain perspective and a measure of comfort from a cross-national survey released just last month. On the one hand, throughout North America and Europe, there's widespread discontent with how democratic institutions are performing. On the other hand, support for representative democracy averages 80% throughout this area. By contrast, only 13% support a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from the legislature or the courts. Even fewer, I'm happy to report, support military government. This said, representative democracy is not the only option with substantial public support in North America and Europe. Fully 70% favor referenda in which citizens vote directly on major national issues. And 43% believe that allowing experts to make decisions about what is best for their countries makes sense, at least in some circumstances. So while publics are not turning their backs on representative democracy, they're willing to consider other forms of decision-making. Here's some additional evidence, hot off the press. Over the past year, I've been part of a bipartisan voter study group that has been working to understand not only the 2016 presidential election, but also Americans' view of their democratic system. Here again, the news is mostly good. 78% believe that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. 83% think that it's very important to live in a democratic system. Still, 23% are open to a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress and elections, and 18% would countenance military rule. Openness to undemocratic alternatives was most pronounced among voters who combine economic liberalism and cultural conservatism, the policy profile most characteristic of American populists. It was also evident among voters who favor one primary culture over cultural diversity, believe that European heritage is important to being an American, and harbor highly negative views of Muslims. Half the voters who supported Barack Obama in 2012, but who switched to Donald Trump in 2016, favored a strong leader unencumbered by Congress, the courts, and elections, and declined to endorse democracy as the best form of government. It is not clear that these findings represent a sharp break from the past. Overall support for a leader who can act unchecked by Congress and the courts is no higher than it was 2 decades ago. Those of you familiar with Marty Lipset's scholarship will recognize similar themes from his book, The Politics of Unreason, published in 1970, and from the work he did on working-class authoritarianism in the 1950s. Nevertheless, there are grounds for concern, not least because our system allows aroused minorities to exercise disproportionate influence. In practice, and I underscore this, not every manifestation of populism threatens liberal democracy. While the Brexit vote raised some complex issues about parliamentary sovereignty, it ultimately pivoted on policy concerns. Disputes about trade, immigration, and even the appropriate reach of national sovereignty can occur within strong liberal democratic institutions and norms. In the long run, I would argue, the effort to place such issues beyond the pale of political contestation will do more to weaken liberal democracy than robust debate ever could. But sometimes the populist challenge does directly threaten liberal democracy. Left unchecked, moves to undermine the freedom of the press, weaken constitutional courts, concentrate power in the hands of the executive, and marginalize groups of citizens based on ethnicity, religion, or national origin will undermine liberal democracy from within. Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, is frank about his antipathy to liberalism. The country that gave birth to the Solidarity movement is following his lead. We dare not ignore these developments, which could be harbingers of worse to come. As Abraham Lincoln once said, as the clouds of crisis gathered, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. In the time remaining, I can only gesture towards the elements of a liberal democratic response to the populist challenge, about which I've written at considerable length in my forthcoming book. Let me just tick off some points. First, we have to focus relentlessly in identifying and countering threats to liberal institutions. An independent judiciary, freedom of the press, the rule of law, the protected space for civil associations, secular and religion, represent the first line of defense against illiberalism, and they must be protected at all costs. Second, as I just indicated, we should distinguish between policy disputes and regime-level threats. Populist parties often espouse measures such as trade protectionism and withdrawal from international institutions that challenge established arrangements, but not, in my judgment, liberal democracy. In a similar vein, it's important to distinguish between the liberal element of liberal democracy and what is often called cultural liberalism. Liberal Democrats can adopt diverse views on issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, local traditions, and the accommodation of religion, while remaining true to their fundamental political creed. Third point, liberal Democrats must make their peace with national sovereignty. Political leaders can assert the right of their nations to put their interests first and go their own way without necessarily threatening liberal democratic institutions and norms. Again, this is a policy dispute within liberal democracy, not about liberal democracy. Fourth, we should recognize that control of borders is an attribute of national sovereignty, and that liberal Democrats can have a wide range of views on the appropriate number and type of immigrants. It is not illiberal for a country to conclude that high levels of immigration are placing excessive stress on its capacity for absorption, and that a reduction or even a pause may be in order. It may be illiberal if it's done for the wrong reasons, but it is not necessarily illiberal. No issue has done more than immigration to spark the rise of contemporary populism, and finding a sustainable compromise would drain, I believe, much of the bile from today's liberal democratic politics in the United States and throughout the West. Fifth, it's time to forget about economic aggregates and focus on inclusive growth. That is, the kind of economic policies that improve well-being across demographic lines, including class and geography. Allowing the well-off strata of society to commandeer the lion's share of gains from growth is a formula for endless conflict. So is allowing the concentration of economic growth and dynamism in fewer and fewer places, as is happening not only in the United States, but in many other democratic countries as well. Sixth, we have to work for the kinds of political reforms that restore the ability of liberal democratic institutions to act effectively on the people's behalf. Gridlock frustrates ordinary citizens and makes them more open to leaders who are willing to break the rules in order to get things done. Finally, and more elusively, but I think not trivially, although modern economies and political institutions depend on highly developed talent and skill, individuals who have climbed to the top through education cannot allow themselves to display a sense of moral superiority to their fellow citizens. Denying the equal dignity of worth of other citizens is self-defeating. Insult does even more than injury to fuel resentment, which is among the most dangerous and destructive of all political passions. I conclude with some brief reflections about why this is happening. Why, above and beyond all of the recent historical trends and forces that I've listed. In my view, there is an enduring and inescapable vulnerability of liberal democracy to contemporary populism and other challenging forces. Why is this? Well, liberals are anti-tribal. They cherish particular identities while subordinating them to broader conceptions of civic and even human identification. But citizens often crave more unity and solidarity than liberal life typically offers, and community, even repressive community, can be a satisfying alternative to the burdens of individual responsibility. Preferring those who are most like us goes with the grain of our sentiments more than does a wider, more abstract concept of equal citizenship or humanity. So does the tendency to impute good motives to our friends and malign intent to our foes. Antipathy has its satisfactions, and conflict, like love, can make us feel more fully alive. Populism's embrace of tribalism, its Manichaean outlook, and the constant conflict it entails all draw strength from the enduring incompleteness of life in liberal societies. This renewed sense of vulnerability helps explain why in just 25 years, the partisans of liberal democracy have moved from triumphalism to despair. But neither sentiment is warranted. History does not move us inexorably toward a liberal democratic world. Liberal democracy is not the end of history for the simple reason that nothing is. Everything human beings make is subject to erosion and contingency. Liberal democracy is fragile, constantly threatened, always in need of repair. But liberal democracy is also strong because to a greater extent than any other political form, it harbors the power of self-correction. Not only do liberal democratic institutions protect citizens against tyrannical concentrations of power, they also provide mechanisms for transforming the public's grievances and unmet needs into effective reforms. To be sure, the power of self-correction is not always enough to prevent liberal democracies from crumbling. As we learned in the 1920s and 1930s, the combination of public stress and strong undemocratic movements can be irresistible, particularly in newer, less well-established democracies. But the oft-heard analogy between those decades and our current situation obscures more than it reveals. Today's economic ills pale in comparison to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and today's autocratic regimes lack the ideological power that fascism and communism enjoyed at our peak. Still, there is no cause and no excuse for complacency. The current ills of liberal democracy are deep and pervasive. Surmounting them will require intellectual clarity and political leaders who are willing to take risks to serve the long-term interests of their countries. Human choice, not historical inevitability, will determine liberal democracy's fate. For now, democratic publics want policy changes that give them hope for a better future. Left unmet, their demands could evolve into pressure for regime change. It is up to the partisans of liberal democracy, here and around the world, to do all they can to prevent this from happening. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, it was a wonderful lecture. Thank you for that, Bill. And now we have time for questions. There are microphones set up at either side of the room. If you would like to pose a question to the lecturer, please come to one of them. And don't be shy.
There's always an early shyness that dissipates quite quickly.
Go to the microphone. Yes. Anybody? identify yourself when you ask a question. So let's start at that end, and then we'll go to David Epstein here.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder, how do you make those conclusions like progress of society and democracy, and whether voters they are really vote? My question is, how do you get verify those data, their accuracy, and their truth?
Yeah.
I mean,
Could you repeat it, please?
my question is accountability and reliability of data you collect. And once you collect, you interpret whether the society is getting better, democracy is improved, well-being of our public is better. That's why you want to go that direction. So accountability and reliability of your data is very important. So how do you verify that?
Well, I think I've grasped your question, and if your argument is that it's difficult to make good decisions without accurate and reliable data, I couldn't agree more. The good news is that in many instances, both public and private institutions produce such data. The bad news is that policymakers routinely ignore it. So in my judgment, the core of the matter right now is not that we are being led astray by poor information. It's that we are being led astray by the unwillingness to make use of good information.
I'm David Epstein. Bill, thinking mostly about the United States, I wondered if you could reflect on the longer history. I mean, you sort of presented this from the last 25 years, but a lot of the diagnosis of the underlying problem, as you noted, is present from the beginning. In the Federalist, they described people's tribalism and the risk of majority faction oppressing minorities and the risk that people will be impatient with constitutional forms. All those things seem always to have been possible, and in the last 200 plus years, a lot of things have happened. People have often been discontented with public policy and have sought new leadership. So is this time different, or is this just another turn of the wheel and you have corrections in the same way that has happened before?
Well, I began to answer that question in my lecture with a profession of faith. And that is that liberal democratic institutions, whatever their flaws, have demonstrated through much history a capacity for self-correction in the face of apparently overwhelming difficulties. There are lots of historical examples of that. There are also what might be called spikes of discontent throughout our history. When the public sense that its voices are not being heard, its needs are not being met, that people with interests other than theirs are somehow having a disproportionate sway over public policy, movements grow up in response to those sentiments, and those movements erupt into a previously stable political space. That's a reasonable thumbnail description of the turmoil that led eventually to Andrew Jackson's election as President of the United States. It's a reasonably good description of the kind of turmoil that existed in the 1880s and 1890s with the rise of the populist movement, the nomination of a populist as the nominee of the Democratic Party, which is a bit akin to the nomination of a populist in our own time as the candidate of the Republican Party. The difference is that Bryan lost 3 times, and Mr. Trump so far has won once. It would be rash and beyond the evidence. It wouldn't be a net assessment. It wouldn't even be a gross assessment to say, to say that we can be confident that we will do as well this time as we have previously, namely that we've survived and we've thrived. On the other hand, centuries of outsiders have gone broke betting against the United States, and I still think it's not an even money bet. So in your terms, I think that this is another turn of, you know, a history characterized by long cycles. And I cannot tell you how we're going to get out of this or how long it's going to take us to get out of this, but I do know that if enough people set their minds to it, we will get out of this.
Thank you. One question I might pose, Bill. I know you've written something about cycles in immigration, and I wonder if you might say something about that and how you see that issue proceeding.
Well, as many politicians in your nation's capital often say, thank you for asking. Because actually the history of immigration policy is quite interesting. And I guess I would focus on 3 episodes. First of all, the surge of Irish immigration into New England, and then more broadly, starting in the late 1930s and accelerating through the potato famine of the 1840s. And second, the extraordinary wave of immigrants from southern Europe, as opposed to the northern European populations that had previously come to this country in the 4 decades between the 1880s, 1880 and 1920, and then in our own time, a third great surge. In each one of those cases, the surge of immigration has been followed by a reaction that has sought to regulate immigration either by source or by number or both. I think there's a close analogy between the situation in our own times and the situation that prevailed in 1920. By 1920, these waves of immigration had raised first-generation immigrants as a share of the U.S. population to about 15%. In 1921, we passed a series of immigration restriction laws culminating in the law of 1924, which all but slammed the gate shut. They remained shut for 41 years, with some very malign consequences, including the refusal of the American government to accept boatloads of Jewish refugees who were fleeing Europe for their lives. In the 41 years in which the gates were slammed shut, the share of first-generation immigrants as a chunk of the population declined by 2/3, from 15% to under 5%. We reopened the immigration gates and opened ourselves up to immigration from new sources in Central and South America, from East Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, and elsewhere. And here, 50 years later, we're basically back to where we were in 1920. That is, immigration between first-generation immigrants is a share of the total between 14 and 15%. And we are experiencing a version of what we experienced in the late teens and early 20s, when people became increasingly alarmed, not just about the numbers of immigrants, but the extent to which they were changing American culture, and from the standpoint of people who've been born here, not for the better. I can't predict whether the legislative outcome will be the same as it was in 1924. I hope not, because it represented a drastic overreaction to a genuine problem. But if we don't react to the problem, then sooner or later we're going to overreact to it, which is why I emphasized in my remarks that reaching some sort of concord and compromise on the issue of immigration, I think, would be the single best thing we could do to drain some of the bile from the American political system. Whether or not that's possible, I don't know, but a bunch of us are trying to make it happen.
Thank you, Bill. Next.
Hi, my name is Malik Siraj Akbar. I'm a former fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and a journalist from Pakistan. My question is about soft power. Do you think America's soft power is also shrinking? See, there are many countries, including my country, Pakistan, which look at the United States as a leader, where there's democracy promotion efforts, there's the free media, there are human rights groups. A lot of these organizations, including the media, look at the U.S. as the leader. While the United States is nursing its own wounded democratic system, what do you think is going to be the impact of the situation that exists in the United States? Do you think the U.S. soft power is shrinking in the midst of countries like China and Russia expanding their, what they describe as soft power as well in these countries?
A very good question, and I wallow in the data on this question, some of the best of which is produced by the Pew Research Center in its Global Studies division. On the one hand, the United States still enjoys a substantial measure of respect around the world. On the other hand, I think an all things considered judgment would be that our soft power has diminished, and it's a diminution that began well before the 2016 presidential election. And here's why I think that happened in brief. As I look at reasons why people believe in liberal democracy, I can divide them into two broad categories. There's some people who believe in liberal democracy in principle as the best form of government in all circumstances for all people because it rests on moral principles that are correct. And those moral principles are enough for the people who espouse liberal democracy and defend it for that reason. But a much higher share of people who are friends of liberal democracy, I think, fall into the category of performance-based rather than principle-based supporters. And what that means is that if the performance of a liberal democratic government or liberal democracy as a whole falters, it will lose some of the luster and respect that it enjoyed when it was doing better. We spent more than 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union preaching an economic approach that was called the Washington Consensus. And the point of that consensus, which involved globalization, it involved new forms and new strengthening of intellectual property rights, and a bunch of other things, including deregulation, the internationalization of financial institutions, the free flow of capital, etc. And by the way, freer flow of labor. That was supposed to be the key to stability and prosperity as far as the eye could see. This was the period that some people call the Great Moderation, when growth was steady and vigorous, when inflation was in check, interest rates were low, employment rates were high, labor force participation rates were off the charts, etc., etc. So some of our soft power rested on the promise of growth, of prosperity, of stability that the Washington Consensus offered. And the Great Recession that began in December of 2007 in this country dealt a body blow to the credibility of a doctrine that, in my judgment, had always been oversold. So that's one of the things that's happened to weaken soft power. A second thing that's happened is that people have come to question the credibility of the United States for all sorts of reasons. This is, fault can be laid at the feet of both parties and several administrations as to why that's the case. And third, I believe that we weaken ourselves and weaken our soft power to the extent that we cease to present ourselves as the champion of a body of principles that we do not intend to impose on others, but which we recommend for others. To the extent that we abandon that dimension of our international presence, we weaken ourselves, in my judgment, for no good reason. It is one thing to say that imposing democracy at the point of a sword is very rarely successful, and that's true, unless you happen to control the entire country because you defeated it, as we did Germany and Japan after World War II, where we did bring democracy at the point of the bayonet. But it's a very different thing to say that if you can't bring democracy at the point of a bayonet, you should stop promoting it. That's crazy. Self-defeating. And that's what we're doing. And once again, the fault goes beyond a single administration.
Good evening, and first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question has to do with how you see the future of populism in countries where populism is very unlikely to prevail. I'm going to use one concrete example in France. For example, they have the two-round election system, whereby the two main candidates go on to the second round. And the last time a populist candidate, well, the two last times, a populist candidate got through in 2002 and 2017, there was a massive uprising against them, which led to them being soundly defeated by 83% in 2002 and by the high 60% in 2017. So how do you see the future of populism in that kind of country? Is the liberal democracy, for example, in France, threatened in more indirect ways because there is hardly any chance for the populists to actually win an election?
My crystal ball, when it comes even to my own neighborhood, is pretty cloudy. And I can't predict the future of France with confidence. But here's what I can say. In 2002, Mr. Le Pen got 17% of the vote. In 2017, his daughter got 34% of the vote. I don't like that trend line. I'll make a further point, which I think Mr. Macron, with whom I had a chance to meet last year before he launched his political career, would probably agree. And that is that he has entered politics as the savior of France from a rotten, obsolescent political party system. He destroyed the existing party system, at least from the center left to the center right, and folded into a new ensemble. He has issued a huge promissory note to his own people. If he redeems that, he will go down as an historic figure in French history, as great in his own way as Charles de Gaulle and others. If his program fails, après Louis Le Pen. And he believes that, and I believe that. So I think it's much too early to, to recite the epitaph for populism in France. I hope you're right. I think you're right. But there's a not insignificant chance
Very true.
that you're wrong.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, sir. I'm just going to pull the mic out. My name is Raj Gurwal. I'm a member of Parliament from Brampton East in Canada. And you spoke about the rise of populism and how basically an agreement or a reframing of the immigration debate in the U.S. Would try to, counteract the rise of populism. Our country has had a very different experience with immigration. In fact, we've actually just increased our immigration numbers. And one thing I've learned in my 2 short years as an elected official is that the debate on immigration in our nation is really framed on economic benefit, on the economic benefit that immigrants bring to the country, and from coast to fishermen in Nova Scotia to farmers, cherry pickers in British Columbia, and everything in between, and the shortage of labor that we have, and the productivity argument around immigration, and just your thoughts on if that argument could work in the United States, and reframing that debate around immigration, because the economy is relatively doing well, so why the insensitivity towards immigrants in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I've studied your immigration system quite closely, and I'd be happy to swap ours for yours. And I know that a great deal of reflection and debate has gone into the crafting of what I think is a pretty well-functioning immigration system. I wrote a piece about this not too long ago, and in the course of doing research for that piece, I discovered that no other country in the world does immigration policy the way the United States does. 2/3 of the immigrants who enter the United States enter for reasons of family connection. 2/3. The figure in Canada is under 20%. The figure in Australia is about 15%. So we are an anomaly in that we give disproportionate weight to family connections, and in my judgment, inadequate weight to the sorts of national interest factors that have I'd say, ought to play a principal role in the formulation of U.S. immigration policy. Now, does that mean that we only accept people with PhDs? No. But it does mean that one of the threshold questions we consider is the impact of certain flows of immigration on the American economy and society. I don't think there's anything wrong with that in principle. It can turn into prejudice and nativism in practice, but I note with interest in Canada, and you, sir, are a representative of that, that it has led to just the opposite. So I think we need to reconsider immigration policy in the United States from the ground up. In my view, that should not lead to a dramatic reduction in the numbers of immigrants coming into the country, but it should lead to a shift in the kinds of reasons that immigrants are allowed to enter the country.
Thank you. Since our time is running a little bit short, maybe what I will do is take the three questions successively and then ask you to respond. So first,
good evening, Mr. Galston. My name is Hugh Ramla, and my question is about one of your proposed solutions to the threat to liberal democracy, which was the elimination of the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. I'm wondering how you go about doing that in practice without interfering with property rights, which I think are kind of the heart of one of those constraints on government, which form liberal democracies or societies.
thank you. And John?
Hi, John Sullivan. Thank you for a great talk. We really enjoyed it. Very thought-provoking. And one of the thoughts it provoked, it made me think about Chris Walker's recent articles on the rise of sharp power. We have soft power, which we've talked about here for a bit, but sharp power being the Russians, the Chinese, and others that are aiming at the American system, if we take into account the last election and the trolling and botting and all the things that are going on, Facebooking and Googling and everything else. Have you thought about how these countries, which are aiming at the institutional core, the structures, the thinking of our population, can take advantage of these fissures, or is that something that we shouldn't worry about?
Hi, my name is Kolela Manzua. I'm from South Africa. I'm currently at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I came to see you about a decade ago to ask some questions about democracy. That's when the United States was still, of course, enjoying this soft power that we were talking about. But my question is about how I was struck by how the analysis following the election of Donald Trump basically took a very different tack from what it might have been had it happened, say, in Africa. If the events leading up to the election of Trump had taken place, say, in Zimbabwe, what you would have had in the news media and in the analysis would be basically these people are irrational. They don't know what's good for them. They are dumb, they are backward, and that would have been the line of analysis. How could they support somebody like that? But what happens in the United States is the very opposite. There's always a sense of wanting to explain and justify as rational what would otherwise have been described as irrational. And I don't know how you will get around that in kind of overcoming populism. In the past, you were able to do it because racism was a moral question globally, and people could be challenged on a moral basis. Citizens could be challenged. But I don't see American citizens being challenged. And that's precisely because the system rests on their support. So how do you get the very same people that you are fearful of to actually change the way they conduct themselves politically?
Well, I must be brisk. First of all, when I was talking about inclusive growth, I was not talking about expropriation or, the pell-mell violation of property rights. I was talking about the fact that in order for our system to work in the long run, the fruits of growth have to be widely shared. They have to be widely shared across different economic classes, and this point is becoming more and more relevant with every passing year, they have to be broadly shared geographically. There are about 3,100 counties in the United States. There has been perceptible economic growth over the past 10 years in 600 of those counties. The other 2,500 have experienced stagnation or worse. That distinction between growth and stagnation or decay maps very neatly onto the electoral map of 2016 if you do it by county rather than by congressional district or state. If we don't figure out a way of extending optimism, opportunity, and hope to people who now, based on ethnographic literature, including an account of focus groups that I just heard this morning, who now feel hopeless, then our politics is going to go from bad to worse. So what does that mean concretely? Well, I'll give you one example. It may sound like a small example, but it stands for something larger. In the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration made the decision that not only was rural electrification needed for economic purposes, communication purposes, etc., that it had become part of what it meant to be a citizen of full standing in the United States society. If you were outside of the sphere of electricity, you were substantially at the margins of your society. I would suggest that broadband now plays the same role in the 21st century. I think we could do a lot worse than adopt the 21st version of the Rural Electrification Program, the New Deal, as our first order of business. President Trump has talked, I think correctly, about the need for dramatically ramping up infrastructure spending. That would be a really good place to start, in my opinion. I could go on. So the point is not to seize property, the point is to expand opportunity. So that's the first question. As to the second question, John Sullivan's, I said right at the threshold of my talk that I would be focusing on the internal challenges rather than the external challenges. That wasn't because I denigrate the severity of the external challenges at all, au contraire. It's because in a single 40-minute talk, I'd already bitten off more than I could chew, as you could tell, simply focusing on the internal challenges. There are a lot of people who are working full-time on the range of external challenges, including some of my colleagues at Brookings, and they are even more serious than I imagined before I started talking with them. Clearly, the ability to tamper with the flow of information, with political discourse in the United States, the ability to sow discord, even above and beyond the discord that we're bringing on ourselves. I mean, these are very dangerous external threats, and we have to think a lot harder about how to counter them. And finally, the very interesting comparison between the United States and South Africa. I guess I have a different view of the dialogue that broke out in the United States after Mr. Trump's surprise 2016 victory. And cries of public irrationality were abroad in the land. For the first time since 1964, psychiatrists got together to do long-range diagnosis of a presidential candidate, and the defeated candidate described half of the victor's supporters as deplorable, and spelled out in some detail what she found deplorable about them. And she did not credit them, I think it's fair to say, with an excessive degree of rationality or benevolence. So, you know, I don't think that there has been an effort to explain away the results of the 2016 election. As a matter of fact, I think that we've spent a lot more time critically analyzing ourselves than we have critically analyzing the affairs of other countries. And so I don't think the racial dimension does a lot of work as an explanation because it doesn't correspond to the debate that I think we've been having in this country. But we can agree to disagree about that. Thank you very much.
There will be a reception following the lecture. This year will be in the gallery of the embassy, which as you go out is to your left, and you'll see a photo exhibit entitled Collection of 29